Okay, this week we're looking at Chapter 14, which is our robbery, burglary, and related crimes. In addition, we're looking at Chapter 8 in your blue book, which covers your RSMO chapters of 569 and 570. When we start looking at those chapters, we want to get into our definitions again. We've talked about this several times. Definitions are what make our crimes, and we've been able to follow them. For example, if you start looking at extortion in your textbook and then try to find that in the RSMO, you're going to have some difficulty. But if you look at the definitions as far as coercion, to expose a person to hatred, contempt, or ridicule, to harm their credit, business reputation, you can start seeing that coercion meets the definition of extortion. And if we go over to the stealing statute, appropriates property or service as another with intent to deprive, either without his consent by means of deceit or coercion. So we know that if we were going to look at extortion, we could actually look at that coercion as far as a definition and use that as a stealing statute. Another thing that we want to look at is claim of right, and we talked about this a little bit last week in the example of stealing. A parent calls and says, hey, my child took the car without permission. We find out that there's an argument between parent and child, but the child normally drives this vehicle. So the issue is did the child steal the vehicle? And when we look at it, a person does not commit the offense of by damaging, tampering, or operating right upon or making connection with property of another if he or she does so under claim of right. So basically they have reasonable grounds to believe that they have the right to be doing that, which this child would do. So when the parent calls and they want you to charge their child with stealing or tampering, depending on how your jurisdiction charges that, they really haven't done anything. So you're going to have to probably take a different course of action as far as getting that car back, which may just be letting other officers know and if found, telling the child to return it. Now, after they've told the child to return it, and we're talking maybe even an adult child, and they don't, then something else could actually be done with it. So robbery is forcibly stealing through threat or actual physical force. Armed robbery, forcibly stealing, combined with the use of a deadly or dangerous weapon. This would be an aggravating circumstance to that robbery. Simple robbery is often called strong arm robbery. Basically, it's just a threat of violence with no visible weapons. Carjacking, forcibly taking possession of a motor vehicle in possession of another. Home invasion, robbery of persons inhabiting a dwelling. Sudden snatching, form of robbery. So think about this as purse snatching. Somebody runs up and just grabs something and takes off. Extortion, obtaining property by threat of future harm, differs from robbery in that robbery requires immediate threat. If I'm going to rob you, it's give me your stuff now. If I'm going to extort you, hey, you're going to provide me this in the future or right now, or I'm going to do something. So think about the mob going into a business and saying, hey, for a certain amount of money, we'll make sure that your business doesn't burn down. That implied threat is there. Trespass, wrongful intrusion on the land or premises of another. Trespass, as far as we look at it, is almost always a misdemeanor or an infraction, which is lower than the misdemeanor. Defiant trespass is where there's been a warning given, so a sign or even verbal, hey, don't be on my property, and the person does it anyway. When we look at it under Missouri law, this would be simple trespass, would be trespass second degree. Defiant trespass, we would call that trespass first degree. So burglary, unlawful entry in the premises of another with intent to steal or commit a felony. This is from your text. When we look at burglary as far as our statutes go, it's with intent to commit a crime. So again, what your jurisdiction says may be different than what your textbook says. So offense is a person who traffics in stolen property. Robbery differs from the common theft in that force or threat of force must be used to take property from the victim. Theft can occur without force and outside the victim's presence. So robbery has some of the same elements as other thefts to include the taking of the property, but we add that with accomplishment by force or threat of force or intimidation. So when we look at our statute, robbery in the first degree, a person commits the offense of robbery in the first degree if he or she forcibly steals property, and in the course thereof, he or she has, or another participant, causes serious physical injury to any person, is armed with a deadly weapon, and deadly weapon can mean different things. Uses or threatens the immediate use of dangerous instrument against any person, displays or threatens the use of what appears to be a deadly weapon, a dangerous instrument, and this can be subjective depending on what you look up. What do you view as a dangerous instrument? Obviously, a gun or a knife could be a dangerous instrument. Well, what about somebody picks up a brick and says, I will hit you with this? In a lot of cases, that could be considered that dangerous instrument. Or steals any controlled substance from a pharmacy. This, addendum 5 may not always be in a statute depending on, again, where you live and what jurisdiction you're working in. So robbery is forcible stealing. Force must be used in the course of the theft in order to constitute a robbery. Placing a hand in another's pocket to steal its contents is theft. That's going to be felony theft of a person, not necessarily robbery. Using force to escape from the owner after accepting theft may actually work that up into a robbery statute. If you look at our statutes, which we just looked at robbery first degree, robbery second degree, a defendant forcibly steals property and in the course thereof causes physical injury to another person. Now, we don't say exactly how much the physical injury has to be, but we definitely could get into that if somebody was fighting to recover that property. If force is actually used, no threat is needed. Typically, simply the threat of force, but not the actual force, constitute the robbery. So, strong arm, like we talked about a minute ago, hands, fists, feet, mugging, similar offenses. Basically, give me your money or I'll, hit you or something like that. That's what we start looking at as far as that strong arm goes. Threat or intimidation must be immediate bodily harm. I can't say, give me your money or next week I'll do that, because that's going to turn it into extortion. In some jurisdictions, the rest must be such a reasonable person would be afraid. Now, that's subjective again. What is the reasonable person? A reasonable, 17, 18-year-old may be totally different than a reasonable 30-year-old or 40-year-old or somebody that's even elderly. So what would be reasonable for that person? All jurisdictions require that there be a threat of harm. The timid victim who surrenders property to a thief based only on benign conduct has not been robbed. Again, subjective, depending on, how that's looked at. Now, there's quite a bit of case law that goes and gives some examples, but again, it's going to be by your jurisdiction. Aggravated armed robbery. When we start talking about aggravating, that's when we start talking about that weapon being involved. And the weapon doesn't have to be real. If I take a toy gun and convince somebody that's real, then I've usually committed a robbery depending on that jurisdiction. So carjacking, forcibly taking possession of a motor vehicle in the possession of another. So again, I come up, it can be strong arm, it can be with a weapon. It's just a matter of they have the car or they're by the car and it's theirs, and I forcibly take that through threat or physical violence. Depending on what jurisdiction, this could be robbery, this could be stealing, probably not going to be tampering when you look at your tampering statutes. So carjacker may also be convicted of kidnapping. It's not too hard to find cases where people have carjacked a car and there's maybe been a child in the back seat or something like that they didn't realize. Carjacking cases don't necessarily easily fit into theft or robbery criminal statutes because the thief often did not intend to keep the car permanently. When we start looking at our stealing statute, we see that word appropriate property or service of another with a purpose to deprive him or her thereof, either without his or her consent by means of deceit or coercion. So we can use that. The other one that we can look at in Missouri is our tampering statute, which is part of our chapter this week. Tampering is an interesting statute in that a lot of it, when we initially read it, we start looking at utilities and different things like that. But also, when we look at number 2, knowingly receives, possesses, sells, or unlawfully operates an automobile, motorcycle, or other basically motor-powered, transport. So tampering in the first degree, I'm that person that operates that without consent. I don't have to keep it. So if I was just going to joyride, I'm going to leave the vehicle and the owner's going to get it back. Well, that doesn't matter. Under the tampering statute, we look at it, that's just, I operated it, and that's where that comes about. We look at tampering in the second degree, and basically a person commits the offense of tampering in the second degree, tampers with property of another for the purpose of causing substantial inconvenience to that person. And, it's not very specific on what that property has to be. But number 2 is the one we want to look at when it comes to vehicles. Unlawfully rides upon another's automobile, again, without their consent. It also covers utilities, different things like that, so we would get into that. Even though we had the stealing statute as far as theft of utilities, this could be a person that, tampers with a meter box, tampers with the cable television. Even though there's statutes that look at it, it's also in here. So home invasion requires unlawful entry to the dwelling of another with intent to commit a crime. We would look at this as robbery. Could be burglary first degree, but once that person is confronted and we start using force to take property, that's going to put it into that robbery first degree realm. Some states the difference means that a defendant can be convicted of both home invasion and another crime, such as armed violence. We would call that armed criminal action. Other states hold the conviction of home invasion bars conviction of related crimes. Just depends on where you live as far as that goes. So purse snatching for us is going to fall under our felony stealing. And the reason it's going to be felony stealing is that the offender physically takes property appropriated from the person of the victim. So the second I start taking property off your person, and it doesn't say a value, it just says any property. So that pickpocket or somebody like that goes into your pocket and takes anything, then it's going to fall under that felony stealing statute. So purse snatching, similar crimes are examples of distinction. So taking a purse in possession is not robbery. The victim resistance. If they get in a fight over the property, then it can turn into robbery. But that just snatching, probably going to be that felony stealing we're looking at. Extortion, we've talked about this just a few minutes ago. Under common law, extortion was committed by officials who demanded illegal fees for their services. Modern codes make extortion any threat of harm in the future to force another. So we would look at this as coercion. Unlike robbery, taking need not occur. So we just tell somebody that, hey, I'm going to do this, and then they voluntarily follow, what I say. So like we talked about the example of the mob, hey, for a certain amount of money, we'll make sure your business doesn't burn down or anything like that. The person voluntarily gives them the money, but the only reason they did that is that implied threat that if I don't, something's going to happen to my business. So burglary, unlawful entry into a building or inhabitable structure with intent to commit a crime. For us, this is the big one as far as intent to commit a crime, because it doesn't specifically say what the crime has to be. So we look at burglary first degree. Person commits the offense of burglary in the first degree if they knowingly, so there's our couple middle state, enters unlawfully or unknowingly remains unlawfully in a building or inhabitable structure for the purpose of committing a criminal offense therein. I worked a case many years ago where the people would go into an open business, go into the public bathroom, and then climb up in the ceiling, and then they would wait for the building to close. Then they would commit the stealing acts and then go out the front door. So they entered lawfully, but they remained unlawfully as far as that structure goes. To make it first degree, they have to be armed with explosive or deadly weapon, causes threaten immediate physical injury to any person who is not a participant in the crime. So here is could be our home invasion as far as burglary in the first degree. There is present in the structure another person who's not a participant in the crime. When we look at burglary second degree, a person commits the offense of burglary in the second degree when they knowingly enter unlawfully or knowingly remain unlawfully in a building or inhabitable structure for the purpose of committing a crime. So for the purpose of committing a crime can be any crime. So a good example is a couple breakup. One party goes over to the other's new house and sees a third party there. They force their way into the residence and assault the third party. Well, when they knowingly, unlawfully, or unknowingly remain unlawfully in a building or habitable structure with the intent to commit the assault, then go ahead and charge that as your burglary. Because there was other people in the structure that weren't involved in the burglary, that actually would go burglary first degree. So like we talked about, burglary usually unlawful. Buildings got to be open to the public. Now that doesn't count where, let's say we have a local big box store and we know where we can walk and the person walks up to that door that says employees only or no entry, and then that person goes into there and commits a crime. So let's say they go in and they steal from another employee's locker. Well, once they cross that threshold, then you could possibly start looking at that as a burglary charge. If they were to steal the exact same thing out where the public was, it'd just be simple stealing. But they went somewhere where they weren't supposed to be. Entry is satisfied by any part of the burglar's body or tools. So an example would be I'm walking past a house, I see jewelry sitting just inside of a window on a table, and I reach in the window and I grab that because my hand, wrist, forearm actually made entry into that building. That's more than enough for me to actually get that burglary. Using a small child to go through a small opening is entry by adults. Staying behind after business is closed, we talked about that. And then using an instrument to break the plan of the dwelling. So I use a stick to reach in the window and hook something and drag it back out. I could still be charged under the burglary depending on what jurisdiction and how they look at criminally charging it. The dwelling, house of another. We don't look at it as the house of another. We just look at it now as a building or an habitable structure and then go by the definition of what that building actually is. We don't have to have an intent to commit a felony. That is the old common law. Like I showed you just a second ago, we look at it as, intent to commit a crime. We don't say felony. It's just criminal activity now. So other states specify crimes. Again, we just talk about, knowingly and lawfully enter a building or habitable structure with intent to commit a crime. Is there a building? Is there an habitable structure? Did you go in it with intent to commit a crime? If you didn't go in with intent to commit a crime, it's probably going to be simple trespass. So let's say you're out somewhere, your car breaks down, your cell phone is, dead, you need help. You go up and go to a building and the door's unlocked. You walk in, use their phone, call for help. Well, technically, you trespassed. But at the same time, let's say that you saw the building and you thought, well, there's nobody here. I'll just go in and see what they've got. If there's anything of value, I'll take it. Well, that changed that trespass to burglary in that before you actually made entry into that building, you had thought about what the criminal activity is going to be. Now, same scenario number one. You go in, you use the phone. Instead of just leaving after help's on the way, you decide that you're going to rummage through stuff and maybe you steal something with a value less than that felony amount. Well, truthfully, you didn't enter with intent to commit a crime, so you're probably going to have trespass and stealing as far as that goes. It's all about the intent as far as before the entry into that structure. Trafficking in stolen goods, that falls under our stealing statute. We don't have receiving stolen property. That got changed in 2017. But depriving the owner of lawful interest therein receives, retains, or disposes of property of another, knowing that it has been stolen or believing that it has been stolen. This is a really interesting word right here as far as believing. In that you talk to somebody, they've got property, and it's not theirs. Where did you get it? Well, I got it from so-and-so. Well, where did he get it? I don't know. Do you think he stole it? Well, probably. Well, when you look at that, when they make that admission to you, does that constitute believing as far as what your jurisdiction is saying? Now, this is Missouri law, so you've got to be cautious as far as what statute you're working under. Offense, a person who traffics in stolen property. So the thieves go out, they've got to get rid of the property. They go to someone that, illegally deals in that. A lot of times you'll see this in drug cases where somebody takes the stolen property and trades it for drugs. And then you go do a search warrant on that house and you'll find all sorts of property that you can track back to different crimes. but the person in possession of it didn't steal it themselves. Other people brought it and traded it for whatever they're, selling illegally. So fence acts as a middle person, pays the thief for stolen property, usually going to be a lot lower than what the property is actually worth, and then they turn around and sell it or trade it to someone else. So, possession of burglary tools, interesting statute, in that by the statute, a person possesses any tool, instrument, or other article adapted, designed, or commonly used for committing or facilitating offenses involving forcible entry into a premises, with a purpose to use or knowledge that the same person has the purpose of using the same in making unlawful forcible entry into a building. So when we start looking at this statute, almost any tool that you can think of could be a burglar's tool. At the same time, it is a normal tool. So me working, with wrenches, screwdrivers, pry bars, hammers is pretty common. And for me to accidentally leave a wrench or a screwdriver in my back pocket and go to the store to pick something up, that would be common. But at the same time, it's 2 o'clock in the morning and I'm walking down an alley with a screwdriver and a hammer in my back pocket. That's not as much common. So you come into contact with that person, and through, your voluntary interview, the person admits, yeah, I was carrying these around. I haven't done any burglaries, but if I found a door that was locked, I was going to use a screwdriver and a hammer to make entry into that door. Well, that person has just told you that they're in possession of burglary tools, and you could actually use that. The offense is a Class E felony, so it's the lowest class felony that we've got, but that person is using those items to make that entry, so we can charge it as burglary tools. But again, you're going to have to show that those tools were going to be used. Otherwise, they're just common tools that are legal for everyone to possess. So, defendant had advice or implement in his possession that was suitable for and capable of committing a burglary. And then again, like I said, the defendant intended to use the device to break into a building. Kind of a hard case to prove. Usually, you're going to have something where you can match maybe the tools that you recover from the person up to damage done, or some type of an admission. Property damage, vandalism, serious problem. Every city deals with vandalism, and Missouri is no exception. It tends to occur in cycles depending on what we're doing. Different areas have different types of vandalism. Graffiti is a big one that most jurisdictions deal with. So when we look at our statutes, again, it's like other crimes, broke down to degrees. Knowingly damages property of another to extent exceeding $750. If they're trying to defraud an insurer, knowingly damages a motor vehicle of another, and the damage occurs while such person is making entry into the motor vehicle for the purpose of committing the crime of stealing. So somebody is trying to get into a car and they break a window. Now, it doesn't usually cost $750 to replace a window, but because they were making entry to commit the crime of theft, that's going to kick that up into a first degree. And then we look at what degree felony it would be based off what it says in that offense. Now, this can change over time. When you look at property damage and value amounts, we want to keep up with that every year and be rereading these statutes. So we turn around and we look at property second degree. Person commits the offense of property damage in the second degree if he or she knowingly damages property of another, damages property for the purpose of defrauding an insurer. So when we look at that, it doesn't give us an amount. We just look at damaged property. The last one we want to look at today is trespass. So a person commits trespass if they knowingly enter unlawfully or knowingly remain unlawfully in a building or inhabitable structure upon real property. So real property is any property. A person does not commit the offense of trespass in the first degree by entering or remaining upon real property unless the property is fenced or otherwise enclosed in a manner designed to exclude intruders, or as to which notice against trespass is given. So purple paint, fenced, signage, that's what we're going to have to give that trespass in the first degree, or they've been told, don't come back. This will happen with businesses that somebody gets caught shoplifting. They'll give them a trespass notice and say, you're not to be in our business anymore. If they do come back on the property, they've been warned, and you can go ahead and charge that as trespass in the first degree. It's going to be a B, misdemeanor, so it's not exactly a high crime, but it's definitely one that somebody could get themselves arrested for. Trespass in the second degree would be a little bit different, but we need to start looking at, was the property posted? So posting a property as trespassers, purple paint used to mark streets, post requirements. In addition to posting real property, a person can use purple paint and mark trees or posts on the property. It's got to be very specific, a vertical line at least 8 inches in length. At the bottom of the mark should be no less than 3 feet or more than 5 feet, so that it's visible from that property line. When somebody says, I've marked my property, make sure it meets your statute, and then when you do your report, put that in there exactly what you saw where it met that statute. Trespass in the second degree. A person commits a trespass in the second degree if he or she enters unlawfully upon real property or another. This is a absolute liability, or the word that you're probably going to be more familiar with is a strict liability, in that there's no culpable mental state. The good part about this is because you could do this so unintentionally. You walk through a neighbor's yard, technically you've trespassed in the second degree. It's only an infraction. So basically the worst that can happen is a fine. You're not going to be jailed for an infraction. Okay, so that is it for this chapter. I do want you to make sure that you go through your Chapter 8 pretty specifically. There's some crimes in there on computers. It's interesting that we put it in that chapter in the blue book, but what does that actually mean? Remember to read your text, remember to read your definitions, and then also start really thinking about when these criminal activity can cross over. When does that stealing become a burglary? When does that burglary become a robbery? When does trespassing become burglary? So you've got to start thinking about those and make those decisions. So that's it for this week.